Animals were relative latecomers to life on Earth. They first appeared about 590 million years ago in the ocean. Um, Pretty not that long after in the scale of evolution, something called the Cambrian explosion occurred. That was during the Cambrian era. That's where the name comes from. And that's when there was a really big flourishing and diverging of animal life. And it's during that period that the first vertebrates appear. And this was around the time that land plants were first moving onto land out of water. And animals would follow plants onto land pretty shortly after. And remember, that makes sense because animals are heterotrophs and need to eat food, and plant would be a primary food source for them. So we think that the closest ancestors of animals are the choanoflagellate protists. So to remind you, we are in supergroup Opisthokonta, and within supergroup Opisthokonta, we have two lineages, the fungal lineage and the animal lineage. And so we have kingdom Animalia here, and we have the choanoflagellate protists as their closest relatives, and then we have kingdom fungi and Nuclearia as their closest protist relatives. So again, these two major lineages, we're now exploring the animal lineage, kingdom Animalia and the choanoflagellates, which are their closest protist relatives. So the way that we hypothesized this occurred was that we had choanoflagellate protists who were living in colonies. So when organisms live in colonies, they are choosing to live together, but it's not required. So it's not required for their survival in the sense that they are not specialized. So each cell within a colony is still able to do all of the things that it needs to do. It's not relying on other cells to do its function. So that's the difference between colony versus truly multicellular. So we're distinguishing being colonial from being truly multicellular. So in colonies, again, organisms are maybe living together and they may even be benefiting by living together. They may be sharing resources or helping each other out, but they're not specialized in the sense that they are not able to give up functions. They haven't lost the ability to do things. And are fully requiring the other cells. Whereas in truly multicellular organisms, cells become specialized and have specific functions, and they require other cells to carry out other functions. And so we think that the choanoflagellates started to make that transition to having specialized cells, and this would give rise to the earliest animals, the sponges. And part of how we hypothesize this is that if you look inside of sponge tissue, there are certain types of sponge cells, and this one is illustrated here, called a choanocyte, that looks remarkably like a choanoflagellate cell. So it seems to be retaining the characteristics of the choanoflagellate ancestor. And again, this suggests this close relationship where colonial choanoflagellates started to transition to having specialized cells, and this would give rise to sponges, which are truly multicellular. They have choanocytes that serve certain functions, amoebocytes, and other types of cells with specialized functions, making them truly multicellular. So animals have several characteristics specific to kingdom Animalia. Notice that this list here says most animals. So one of the things that I'll point out is that sponges, especially, and some of the other early animals, don't have as many of these traits, or they have them in a more simplistic form. So all animals are multicellular heterotrophs. So again, they have specialized cells that rely on each other. They're heterotrophic, that means they must eat other things. They lack cell walls. So plants and fungi both have cell walls, animals don't. Most animals have some kind of nervous system, some type of muscle tissue, and those operate together to create the ability to move at some point in their life cycle. But remember that movement is not required to be an animal. So this is probably one of the biggest areas of confusion, is because we associate animals with movement and many animals do move, we think that all animals have to move. But in fact, many animals will have non-mobile parts of their life cycle, or they might spend most of their life not moving. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Animals can reproduce sexually. They have specialized sensory structures, most of them do, as well as a nervous system to interpret those the sensory input. So when we say sensory structures, we're talking eyes, ears, our senses. Okay, and so to interpret what your eyes see, you need a nervous system to understand that. The cells in animals exist in an extensive extracellular matrix. So you might have animal cells, so I'll draw a couple of cells here. So a single layer of cells, and then those layers, that layer of cells is actually embedded into this thick complex called the extracellular matrix. And in fact, a lot of animal tissue is more extracellular matrix than actual cells. And the cells make the extracellular matrix, but it's actually this framework. And this is part of what gives like the feel to animal tissue that makes it different from plant tissue, is this extracellular matrix. In addition to, and kind of going along with the extracellular matrix, animals have unique cell junctions. Cell junctions are connection points between cells and their extracellular matrix. So these are going to operate differently than they do in, say, fungi or plants. And this has to do with a couple of things. Animals not having a cell wall, and animals having this extensive extracellular matrix, and their multicellularity. So they will be able to use these junctions to, for example, communicate with each other. Lastly, most animals have specific type of family of genes called Hox genes. These are homologous throughout the animal kingdom, and they're important for development, especially related to body patterning. So they kind of establish top to bottom, basically, in the early embryo. And when you look at the Hox genes throughout all animals except sponges, they are all homologous. They're very closely related to each other. And they share similar ribosomal RNA sequences. So these are some of our molecular similarities rather than trait similarities. Kingdom Animalia is divided into many phyla. We will cover a lot of those animal phyla, but not all of them. But in addition to phyla, there are several other non-taxonomic ranks or names for groups of animals that we'll be discussing. And those groups are broken out based on several traits, some of them really well correlated to major body plan differences, and some of them a little different than major body plan differences. And that has to do with the fact that these groupings have been changing. So like with all taxonomy and phylogeny, these categories have been changing as we discover new evidence using molecular tools or new tools. And so you see a lot of changes in the way that animals have been grouped. And so we'll be focusing on how they're grouped today by taking a look at this list here, these morphological and developmental features that do reflect phylogeny. So we'll talk about the presence or absence of true tissues. We'll look at type of body symmetry and how that relates to germ layers. We'll also look at how the cells divide during embryonic development is significant to animal evolution. And lastly, how the trait of ecdysis, or also called molting, and certain types of feeding structures and larvae are also significant to evolutionary relationships in animals. So these are the traits we'll focus on in this chapter before exploring animal phyla.